There are things in this world that cannot be explained by logic alone. Sometimes, the truth arrives quietly. Sometimes, it arrives on four hooves, in the dark, led by something older than language. This is one of those stories. Her name was Maren Solberg, and she had lived alone on the edge of the Harrow Valley for 11 years before the horse arrived. Not by her choosing. Not by anyone's choosing, really. The horse had simply appeared one October morning at the edge of her fence line, standing motionless in the thin dawnlight as if he had always been there and she had only just noticed. He was a gray Andalusian with a dark mane and a scar along his left shoulder that had healed badly, thickening into a ridge of pale, wrinkled skin. He had no brand, no tag, no rope around his neck. Nothing to say where he had come from or who had owned him before. He simply stood there, watching the farmhouse with calm, ancient eyes, and Maren, who had long ago stopped believing in coincidence, went up to him with an apple and a rope and brought him inside. She named him Gra, the Norwegian word for gray. She was not a sentimental woman by nature. She kept her name simple. For the first week, Gra was gentle and cooperative. He let her brush him without flinching. He ate steadily and slept in the back corner of the stable with a kind of quiet dignity, as though he had chosen this arrangement as much as she had. Maren found herself talking to him in the evenings, not out of loneliness but out of something closer to recognition. There was intelligence behind those dark eyes. A listening quality. She had owned horses before, 2 of them, years ago, and neither had ever made her feel quite so observed. With those earlier horses she had always been aware, pleasantly enough, of being in the presence of an animal. With Gra she was aware of being in the presence of something that was thinking about her. Those 2 horses had been her husband Eric's idea. He had grown up with horses on his family's property in the north, and when they moved to the Harrow Valley together he had wanted to bring that part of himself along. Maren had learned to ride well enough, and she had come to appreciate the rhythm of the morning feeding, the steam rising from the water bucket, the sound of hooves shifting on straw. But she had never felt the connection Eric described. He used to say that a good horse was like a good friend. Present without demanding. Loyal without explanation. He said it with the ease of someone describing something they had always known, and she had listened and understood the words without quite accessing the feeling behind them. Eric had been dead for 7 years. Pneumonia, swift and indifferent, arriving in February when the valley was buried in snow and the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away on bad roads. He had not made it to 40. The horses had been sold the following spring because she could not afford to keep them and could not bear to look at them, which amounted to the same practical outcome. The stable had sat empty ever since, and Maren had kept it in good repair anyway, the way people maintain things whose purpose they cannot yet admit is finished. She painted the boards when they needed painting. She replaced the broken hinge on the door. She spread fresh straw on the floor each autumn out of a habit she could not quite explain to herself and did not try to. So when Gra appeared at the fence line that October morning, she sometimes wondered, in the private way she wondered about things, whether the stable had been waiting. Whether she had been waiting too, without realizing it. Whether 7 years of quietly maintaining an empty space had been a form of readiness she had not known she was practicing. She did not say this to anyone. It sounded, even in the privacy of her own mind, like the kind of thing her mother would have said, and she had spent most of her adult life being a different kind of person than her mother. But she thought it, and she did not dismiss it entirely. She left it in the category of things not yet decided. Then the disappearing started. The first night it happened, she woke to a stillness that felt wrong. The valley had a particular sound at night, subtle and layered, a combination of wind movement and insect life and the distant sound of the creek and the deep bass note of the land itself breathing in the cold. She had lived here long enough that she heard it without consciously listening, the way you hear the hum of a refrigerator, noticing it only when it stops. Something had stopped. She pulled on her coat and boots and walked to the stable to find the door standing open and GRA gone. The latch was not broken. The fence was intact. She spent the better part of an hour walking the perimeter with a lantern before giving up and going back to bed. When morning came, GRA was standing in the paddock as though nothing had happened, his coat faintly damp with dew, his eyes steady and untroubled. She checked the latch. Checked it again. Could not find the fault. She examined the fence line carefully that afternoon, walking the full perimeter in the pale autumn light. The boards were sound. The wire was tight. There was no gap large enough for a horse to pass through, no section that had been pushed or bent. The ground around the fence posts showed no disturbance. Either GRA had left through the gate, which she was certain she had latched before going to bed, or he had left in some way she could not account for. She stood in the middle of the paddock with her hands in her coat pockets and looked at the stable and the fence and the empty hills and felt the particular frustration of a practical woman confronted with an impractical problem. She did not like problems she could not see the edges of. She made her living by understanding her land and her equipment and her resources clearly and precisely. Mystery was not a category she had much patience for. She went to bed the second night listening hard and woke at 3 to the same wrong stillness. She already knew before she put her feet on the floor. The second night, she bolted the stable door from the outside with a sliding iron bar she had used once to secure a gate during a storm. It was a solid thing, heavy iron, seated in a deep bracket. She went to bed and lay awake listening to the wind. When she woke at 3 in the morning, something had pulled her out of sleep with the same quiet certainty as before. She lay still in the dark for a moment, and then she felt it. The absence of him. She could feel it somehow, the missing weight of his presence in the night, the way you feel the absence of a sound you had not known you were tracking. She went to the stable. The iron bar had been lifted from its bracket and set carefully against the wall. The door was open. GRA was gone. She stood there in the cold for a long time, holding the lantern, looking at the bar. A horse could not do that. There was no physical mechanism by which a horse could lift an iron bar from the outside of a door. And yet here was the bar, resting upright against the wood as though placed there deliberately. As though someone had wanted her to know that they had been careful about it. That whatever was happening, damage was not the intention. She did not sleep again that night. She sat at the kitchen table with both hands around the mug of tea that had gone cold and tried to think clearly. She was not given to supernatural explanations. She had grown up in a practical household, the daughter of a farmer who distrusted anything that could not be touched or measured. Her mother had been the one with the old beliefs, the sense that the land held memory in that animals sometimes knew things that people could not. Marin had absorbed just enough of that sensibility to pause before dismissing things, without quite embracing it either. She lived in the middle ground. She was comfortable there, usually. This was not comfortable. She thought about calling her neighbor Lars, a reliable man 2 kilometers down the valley road who would come if she called and would not make her feel foolish for calling. But she did not yet know what she would tell him. She could describe the facts and they would sound, even to herself, not quite believable. Lars would ask sensible questions. He would make the sensible suggestions she had already made to herself. And at the end of it she would still be alone with the problem in the silence. She decided to wait one more night and see what she could learn on her own. On the third night she did not bolt the door. She sat on the old wooden chair in the corner of the stable with a blanket over her shoulders and a thermos of coffee and waited. GRA watched her for a while, his large head turning slowly as she settled herself, and then he seemed to make a decision. He lay down in the straw, which horses rarely do in the presence of company, and he closed his eyes. The stable smelled of hay and horse and the faint mineral cold of the stone walls. It reminded her, in the complicated way that smells do, of years before. Of mornings she had tried to stop thinking about. She sat with the smell and the memory both and let them be what they were. She fell asleep somewhere around midnight. When she woke, he was gone. The frustration that came then was more personal than the simple frustration of a woman whose property had been breached. She felt, in a way she could not fully articulate, that GRA was keeping something from her. That there was a conversation happening that she was only hearing one side of. She was not afraid, not exactly, though the nights had taken on a strange charged quality, watchful in a way she had not experienced since she was a child waking in the dark to unexplained sounds in the old farmhouse. What she felt most was the particular ache of being left out of something important. She had felt it before. In the weeks after Eric's funeral, when people gathered in her kitchen and spoke to each other about loss in ways that seemed to reach right past her, as though her presence were a reminder rather than a participant. She understood this feeling. She decided she was not going to let it stop her. On the fourth night, she did not try to prevent him from leaving. She waited in the house, fully dressed, sitting in the chair by the front window with the lights off, and watched through the glass. She saw the stable door swing open at precisely midnight. She saw GRA step out into the moonlight, pausing for a moment at the edge of the paddock as though orienting himself, his head lifting to test the air. She watched the line of his body in the moonlight, the way his weight shifted as he made his choice, and then she saw the direction he chose. She gave him 30 seconds and went out after him. The valley beyond her property was terrain she knew in daylight, rolling and pale with dried autumn grass, broken by stands of birch trees and occasional rocky outcroppings that caught the moonlight and threw it back cold and clean. She had walked it 100 times. At night it was different. The familiar shapes rearranged themselves into something slightly foreign. Distances became uncertain. The birch trees that were distinct and individual in daylight merged at night into a single pale mass, their white bark luminous, their branches bare and intricate against the sky. The cold had a different quality too. Not the manageable cold of outdoor work, but the older cold of open ground at night, the kind that comes up through the soles of your boots and reminds you that the warmth of a human body is a small and specific thing. She moved quietly, keeping GRA just within sight, close enough to track but far enough that she hoped he could not hear her footfalls on the frost-stiffened grass. She was a quiet walker by habit, someone who had learned over years of early mornings that the valley gave more of itself to those who moved through it gently. She kept her breathing slow. She kept her lantern shuttered. He moved with purpose. There was no wandering in him, no grazing, no distraction. He walked in a straight line through the grass with the deliberate calm of someone who knows exactly where they are going and how long it will take. She had seen that quality in people occasionally. A parent moving through a crowd toward a child they have spotted. That complete absorption of direction that leaves no room for anything else. In a horse, at midnight, moving through dark countryside alone, it produced in her a chill that was not entirely from the air. She followed him for 20 minutes. The ground changed beneath her feet, rising slightly and then descending, the grasses giving way to rougher scrub at the margins of the creek that marked the edge of her property. GRA crossed the dry creek bed without pausing, his hooves quiet on the exposed stones, and entered a shallow bowl of land she had always thought of as a natural depression. Good for nothing much. Too low to cultivate, too uneven to build on. She had walked through it dozens of times on her wider rambles and had never felt anything particular about it except a vague noting, the way you note a room in a house you visit regularly but never spend time in. GRA stopped at the center of the bowl. He lowered his head. Marin stood at the edge of the depression, maybe 30 meters away, watching him. Her breath clouded in the cold air. The moonlight was clear enough that she could see him well, the silver of his coat, the dark line of his mane, the stillness of his stance. He was completely still. His head was bowed toward the ground at a particular spot, and he stood that way for a long moment, not shifting his weight, not lifting his head to check the wind or the dark around him. The stillness of attention, of listening. She had the sudden strong sense that he had been doing this for longer than she knew. That this posture, this exact posture, was a well-worn thing. And then Maren heard it. It was faint. So faint that at first she thought she had imagined it, a trick of the wind or the particular acoustics of the bowl. But she held herself still and listened, and it came again. Not wind. Not water. A sound with a different quality entirely. Thin and strained, passing through earth and distance until it barely existed as sound at all. A sound that had edges to it. A pattern. Something that had once been louder and was now nearly spent. She walked toward GRA. He did not startle or move away as she approached. He turned his head to look at her with those dark, steady eyes, and then looked back at the ground. She stood beside him and looked down and saw nothing. Dry grass. Cold earth. A faint hollow where the frost had settled differently, the ground slightly lower here, the grass slightly yellowed compared to what surrounded it. Nothing that would have drawn her attention in daylight. Nothing she would ever have noticed on her own. She pressed her ear to the ground the way she had seen her father do once when checking the soil for underground water, feeling slightly ridiculous, not caring about that at all. The cold came up through the earth and pressed against her cheek like a hand. She closed her eyes and cleared her mind and listened with everything she had. There it was. Not a sound exactly. A vibration. Something below the surface, faint and rhythmic, too regular for geology, too alive for machinery. She pressed harder against the ground and held her breath, and the vibration became a little clearer, a little more defined, and it had a character to it now that she could almost name. The character of effort, of intention, of something that had not yet given up. She stood up quickly. Her heart was going very fast. She looked at GRA, who was looking at her with a calm she found almost unbearable. As though he had been waiting for this moment of understanding for some time and was glad it had finally arrived. She ran back to the house. She called the emergency services from the landline, the old rotary phone on the kitchen counter she had never replaced because it worked perfectly and she saw no reason to change things that worked. She tried to explain what she had found. She gave her address. She described the location as best she could, the shallow bowl past the creek line, 200 meters beyond the eastern fence. She said she believed someone was trapped underground and she did not think there was much time. The operator told her to stay on the property and wait for emergency responders. She said thank you and put the phone down carefully and went to the tool shed and got the long-handled shovel. She went back to the bowl, walking fast, her lantern open now, swinging in her hand. GRA was still there, still standing in the same spot, his head still lowered. She came past him without stopping and planted the shovel in the earth where he stood and began to dig. The frozen upper layer resisted badly. Her arms ached within minutes. The frost had sealed the surface into something closer to stone than earth, and she had to chip and chip before she could get any purchase. It was slow and it was hard, and she did not let herself think about how slow and hard it was. She thought about the vibration, about the character of it, about effort, about something that had not yet given up. She kept digging. Below the frost line the soil loosened, and she found a rhythm. Chip and lift and turn. The lantern cast a yellow circle around her, and beyond it the bowl was dark and the night was dark, and GRA stood just at the edge of the light, watching. She did not look up at him. She focused on the shovel and the earth and the rhythm, and she went down. The shovel hit wood. She stopped. She breathed. She could hear her own breathing very clearly. She cleared the earth around the edge with the blade of the shovel turned sideways, working the perimeter of what she had found, and when she had cleared enough she could see it in the lantern light. A trapdoor of rough planking, old but intact, its hinges rusted deep reddish brown, covered by 40 centimeters of compacted earth in years. It had a latch on the outside. The latch was engaged. She tried to lift it and could not get the angle right. She wedged the shovel blade into the gap at the edge and used it as a lever, and the door came up with a sound like a long breath being released, a sigh of old wood and sealed air meeting cold night air for the first time in days, and she pulled it back and held the lantern over the opening and looked down. The man inside was barely conscious. He was perhaps 60 years old, thin, with gray stubble and a bruise along one temple that had swollen badly and darkened. He was wearing a padded work jacket and heavy boots, curled on a sign on a dirt floor about a meter below the surface, in a space about the size of a large wardrobe. A root cellar. Old, half forgotten, and fitted with a trapdoor latch that could only be engaged from outside. There was an empty water bottle near his hand. A small electric torch whose battery was nearly dead, its light a faint orange smear in the darkness below. He had been there for 3 days. He opened his eyes when the cold air reached him. He looked up at Marin, and at the open sky above her, and at Gra standing just behind her shoulder. His face did something complicated and quiet. His lips moved. She leaned down as close as she could. He said, "I heard the horse." She said, "I know. Stay still. Help is coming." His name was Felix Hauer. He had been doing survey work for a geological consulting firm, cataloging subsurface features across the valley floor for a pipeline assessment. He had been working alone because his partner had taken ill the day before and the schedule was tight, and he had not wanted to fall behind. He had found the root cellar by accident, a depression in the ground that had given way underfoot, the rotted covering of old boards collapsing under his weight without warning. He had fallen through and the trapdoor had swung down above him and the external catch had locked. There had been no gradual understanding of his situation. One moment he was standing in open countryside under an afternoon sky, and the next he was in the dark below the earth with a bruised head and no light and the sound of his own breathing. He had shouted until his voice gave out, which took most of the first day. He had banged on the underside of the trapdoor with his fists and then with his torch until his hands were swollen and the torch cracked. He had made himself drink slowly, rationing the single water bottle he had with him. He had kept moving in small, careful ways to preserve body heat, gentle exercises in the confined space, because the cold came up through the dirt floor and the cold of the earth is a particular patient kind of cold that does not negotiate. He had felt the approach of something irrevocable as the hours became a day and the day became 2 days and the second day became a third. Not panic, but its opposite. A terrible calm. The body beginning its quiet negotiations with the idea of not continuing. On the second night, he had heard something moving above him. He had pressed his ear to the earth of the ceiling and felt rather than heard the vibration of hooves on the ground above. A horse. Walking pace. Stopping nearby. He had made the most noise he could after that, which was not very much. He had pressed his palm flat against the underside of the trapdoor and pushed in a slow, steady rhythm, not to open it. He had long since understood he could not open it from below, but to make movement. To announce himself. To say, to whatever might be above him and might be listening, "I am here. I have not stopped." He had then fallen into a half-sleep and dreamed of a gray horse standing in sunlight in an open field, and in the dream he had not been afraid because the horse was watching him with the particular attention of something that knew exactly where you were and intended to bring you back. He had woken to the sound of digging. The paramedics arrived 20 minutes after Marin's call. They found her kneeling at the edge of the open cellar, talking to Felix in a low, steady voice about nothing much. The weather. The valley. The particular quality of autumn light in this part of the country. She talked simply to give him sound to follow, a thread of ordinary human life to hold while the cold in the dark receded. GRA stood slightly behind her, perfectly still, watching the operation with the air of something that has known how this would end and has been waiting for everyone else to arrive at the same understanding. Felix spent 4 days in hospital recovering from moderate hypothermia and dehydration and a mild concussion the doctors considered fortunate given the mechanism of injury. He had no lasting damage. He was discharged on a Thursday morning into a bright November day, and he sat in the car on the way back to the city and looked out the window and thought about things he had not thought about in a long time. He sent Maren a letter 3 weeks later. Long, written by hand on plain paper in careful deliberate script, the script of someone who had thought about every word. He thanked her. He thanked the horse. He wrote about the second night in the cellar, about hearing the hooves above him, and about the particular quality of hope that had arrived in that moment. Not the frantic hope of sudden rescue, but something quieter and more durable. A settling. The sense that he had been found, that the finding was now a matter of time rather than probability, that something above him had registered his location and would not leave. He wrote that he had thought about that feeling many times since and had not found a better word for it than faith, which surprised him as he was not a man who had used that word seriously before. He wrote that one of the paramedics, a young woman who had grown up with horses, had said quietly to her colleague that in 20 years of emergency work she had never seen a horse act like that. Still. Anchored. Like he was standing guard over something he had promised to protect. Maren read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Outside the window the valley was brown and gold with late autumn, the birch trees half bare, the hills rolling away into a pale sky. GRA was visible through the glass, standing at the paddock fence with his head up, watching something in the middle distance she could not see. She folded the letter and put it in the drawer where she kept important things. Eric's watch. An old photograph. Things that needed to be close without being constantly looked at. Then she went out to the stable. The vet came the following spring for his annual check and ran a gentle hand along the old scar on GRA's shoulder and studied it for a moment without speaking. The injury had been made by something hard and angular, he said finally. Something with an edge to it. Not a bite or a kick or wire. He could not be more specific than that. The wound was old. Very old. Healed years ago, the scar fully settled. Maren said nothing. She stroked the ridge of pale skin and thought about edges and old wounds and the things that leave marks that a body carries forward into every new place it finds itself. Her neighbor Lars came that same spring with his daughter Sigrid to help with fence repairs. Sigrid was 11 and serious and expressed her passion for horses by standing as close to GRA as her father would allow and talking to him in a low, intense voice about things Maren could not quite hear. GRA permitted this with composed patience, as though he understood that Sigrid was important in some way that required a particular gentleness. Lars asked, while they worked, how Maren had come to find the man in the ground. She told him simply and directly. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stood with his hands on a fence post and looked out at the valley for a moment. He said, the old Vistrup family had a root cellar out that way. 3 generations back, maybe 4. Dairy farmers. Lost everything in a bad winter and left. He had heard there were structures from that time still buried on the land, but no one had ever mapped them. Maren thought about this. She thought about the trapdoor latch engaging from outside, and the old planking, and the generations of earth that had accumulated above it while the valley went on with its ordinary business of seasons and farming and forgetting. She thought about a horse that carried a scar from an edge like a trapdoor edge. Bad arrived at her fence the morning after a man fell into a buried cellar. Bad returned to that spot every single night in the cold and the dark, standing vigil over something that could not see the light and could not make itself heard, not giving up, not being distracted, not coming back inside until the debt was paid. She did not say any of this to Lars. Some things do not need to be said to be understood. Felix came back to the valley the following September, driving up from the city on a Saturday morning with a bottle of good whiskey and a nervousness he tried to conceal under a practiced ease. He was taller than she had imagined from the letter, broad-shouldered, with the weathering in his face that comes from years of fieldwork. He shook her hand at the door and then seemed to realize a handshake was insufficient and stood there for a moment not knowing what to do, and Maren, who understood the difficulty of situations that exceed ordinary social vocabulary, took him out to meet GRA instead. Felix stood at the paddock fence and GRA came over immediately, which he did not do with everyone. He pressed his nose against Felix's outstretched hand and Felix stood very still and breathed carefully, and Maren stood a little distance away and looked at the hills and gave them a moment. They sat on the porch that afternoon and drank the whiskey slowly and talked about the valley and his work and her farm and the general shape of their respective lives. He was a man who had thought carefully about what had happened to him and what it meant. He had not rushed past it or reduced it to a story he could tell easily at dinner parties. He had sat with it and let it take the shape it needed to take. He said, at one point, that he had found himself thinking about what he owed. Not to her specifically, though he felt that too. More generally, about the texture of a life that had nearly ended in the particular quality of attention that comes after. The way small things had weight now. The way he noticed the light differently. He said he had not expected gratitude to feel so physical. He had expected it to feel like an emotion. Instead, it felt more like a change in the quality of sight. Everything slightly more present. Everything slightly more itself. Maren listened and then said, slowly, that she thought she understood that. That she had had her own version of it, some years ago, and that it was disorienting at first. The reweighting of things. But that over time it settled into something you could carry. Something that was not a burden exactly. More like ballast. The kind of weight that keeps you level in rough water. He nodded. He looked out at the paddock where GRA was grazing in the late afternoon light, moving slowly through the grass with his head down, unhurried and complete. He said, I don't understand him. What he is. What that was. Maren said, no. Neither do I. She said, I think that's all right. He left in the early evening. She watched the car until the road curved and the valley swallowed it. Then she turned back to the farm into the quiet that settled after visitors left, the particular silence that was not loneliness but its opposite. The sense of a space that had been well used and was now resting. GRA was still grazing. His gray coat caught the last of the light and held it, luminous in the way of gray things at dusk, hovering somewhere between color and the absence of it. She leaned on the paddock fence and watched him and thought about loyalty. About the forms it takes when it cannot be spoken. About the obligations carried in the body that the mind has not been told about. About the things that leave marks on you that you carry forward into every new place. She thought about a man lying in the cold dark pressing his palm against wood in a steady rhythm. Not to open it. Simply to announce that he was still there. To say, to whatever might be listening, I am here. I have not stopped. She thought about a horse that heard that. That came back. And came back. And came back again. The winter returned, as it always did, and the valley went white and still and the short days settled into a rhythm of work and fire and early dark. Maren and GRA moved through it with the easy companionship of two creatures who have been through something together and found in each other a kind of home. Not the home of origins or a family. The other kind. The home you arrive at by a road you did not plan to take, through country you did not know you were crossing, led by something you cannot explain and do not need to. She told him about Eric once. About how he had been in his last days. About the particular silence that settled in the house after and the specific quality of that silence, how it was different from ordinary silence, charged with absence in a way that ordinary quiet was not. She had not said these things aloud before, not to any person. They had lived inside her for 7 years in the way that unsent things do, pressing, taking up space without permission. She said them to the horse in the cold stable in the middle of winter, and Gra stood quietly and listened, and when she finished he turned his head and pressed his nose gently against her shoulder. She stood very still and let it happen. She was not someone who cried easily. She cried then. Just enough. And then she blew out a long breath into the cold stable air and watched it cloud and slowly disappear, and felt, in some way she could not name but did not need to, that something had shifted. That a weight she had been carrying for a long time had been, not removed, but redistributed. Shared. Even partially. Even briefly. It was enough. The scar on his shoulder healed no further. It was what it was. A ridge of old damage, carried forward without complaint. She ran her hand along it sometimes in the evenings when she was brushing it down, feeling its particular texture under her fingers, and she thought of all the things that mark us. All the ways the past writes itself into the body. All the distances a creature will travel, through dark and cold and every kind of night, back to the place it has promised itself it will return to. There are things in this world that cannot be explained by logic alone. There are debts older than memory and loyalties that outlast the conditions that created them. There are forms of faithfulness that have no language, that exist entirely in the domain of action, of returning, of standing still above the place where something lives and refusing to leave until someone else arrives who can hear what you have been listening to all along. The gray horse stood in the paddock in the fading autumn light. The hills rolled away into the distance, brown and gold and patient. The valley held its silence the way valleys do, cupped and still, keeping its own long counsel. And Maren Solberg leaned on the fence in the last of the light and looked at what she had, and found that it was more than enough. If this story stayed with you in some quiet way, you can leave a like or share what it brought up for you in the comments below. And if you'd like to return to stories like this one, told slowly, in the manner of something worth sitting with, you're welcome to subscribe. We'll keep the light on.